Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Italy from the mid-14th century to the mid-15th century. We could title this From War to Balance in a certain sense, which is an approximation, but it's particularly important. You know that up to now we've been talking essentially about communal Italy, so the moment, right before, the couple of centuries before this period, and even the genesis of the seigneuries, of the lordships. We never got quite thoroughly into the second part, so I thought today to just give an introduction to the period, explaining why it is important, what was going on there. And specifically, I would say if we really wanted to highlight an element that really passed through the political and military action, right? Because we could even focus just on humanism, on the art of the and that's pretty normal, right? This was a very wealthy place. It was emerging in the continent as the leading country in terms of per capita wealth, of education, literacy, scientific, artistical development, and all this stuff, which is very important. We will discuss naturally in other ways, but it's very often overlooked, I believe, historiographically speaking. And I think this is true not just generally, but even in Italy in itself, to concentrate on the cultural dimension, right? Or at least to look at, even at the political phenomenon as a mostly civil and well, not even strictly juridical aspect, but actually the military phase is particularly meaningful because, in my opinion, it's a moment that shaped the peninsula in this sense, in producing remarkable results, remarkable achievements. We're talking about basically a system that in less than 100 years, less than a century, objectively passed from this kind of scattered, very autonomous, de facto independent city-states that were, tens and tens, even hundreds, depending on which size you take into consideration, even though the major entities were sort of in the range of tens, almost maybe 100, but I don't think so, actually. But whatever, that's not important. But they passed into regional states, which is something very strange, because this was the period in which, in theory, most of the chaos would be unleashed. After that, the empire had basically failed to recover the peninsula, when the papacy and even the Kingdom of Naples were kind of tightening the grip on this area that had been the battleground at that point, not just from the struggle of investitures, but also the clash of the Angevin system with the empire and all this stuff, which roughly continues. I mean, the Ghibelline and Guelph systems kind of keep standing in place. I mean, that's a category you can use even, up to even the Renaissance and into the Renaissance. But let's say that at that point you would imagine this city is, now fragmenting even more. Instead, what happens is the exact opposite. Basically, you have the major cities actually conquering the others, swallowing the others in their territorial domination, and creating the base of a regional state that up to that point had basically no real institutional base whatsoever. Like there were these kind of evidently geographical repartition of the peninsula that were chiefly Lombardy and Tuscany, that in fact become, not surprisingly, the center of two of the major seigneuries in there, but that otherwise had not much previous, let's say, institutional cohesion. Excuse me. Same goes for others. That the major seigneuries at this point are fundamentally Milan, Venice, Florence, and the papal states. Then, of course, there is the Kingdom of Naples, that is this major entity in southern Italy that had an institutional, base. That was something new when it was founded back in the day, but it was now something pretty old and pretty, now sedimented and structured, in spite of all the problems that it had. And where other powers like Genoa, like the Este, like the Gonzaga, or Savoy. There were many others actually that they still remained, like in the range of tens actually, but now the lesser ones were fundamentally very very small, right? And there were these other bigger, we can kind of call them states if we want, by certain standards, that now encompassed great parts. And you will see even the territorial, the physical expansion of these powers that is remarkable. And the comparable area with Italy this time is Germany, once again, because it's fundamentally a country that had similar. It had kind of similar political conditions, in the sense of a weak monarchy. At least Germany had let's say a better functioning monarchy from an institutional point of view than Italy, that didn't have. Italy didn't have a monarchy at this point. I mean, theoretically, yeah, there was the crown, there was the kingdom, and all this stuff, but this was now prerogative just of the Germanic rulers that, at this point, even give up to go there and to claim the crown, because they had seen it was effectively impossible. They were mostly now even trying to get support from the single Italian cities to kind of prevail in princely Germany, etc. But Germany is interesting because, albeit not being solidly urbanized like Italy, it still was a place where it's often stressed the fact that after the extinction of the Hohenstaufen and the collapse of the German monarchy, which happened structurally, had already started during the Hohenstaufen times, exactly because they stayed in Italy, not in Germany, and therefore the local princes starting taking basically everything. Especially in the 13th century, already before the death of Frederick II in 1250. But you would imagine Germany would essentially, go chaotic completely at that point. Instead, and I believe this is my impression, I don't really know, but I believe that Germany specifically had the development of certain princely dynasties that, considered as such, were something quite substantial, quite powerful, right? Even compared to the Italian lordships, these were kind of powers to be reckoned with. They had lots of problems, chiefly because of Germany was on average less productive, but in general it was the same feudal system on which the whole thing was based, and made everything kind of more fluctuating. The Italians had invented something else. They had invented basically a major city-state that extended its power at a provincial level, right? So encompassing, entire, tens of thousands of square kilometers that were as large as, let's say, what I don't know, what the Habsburgs could have, or even other powers out there in north of the Alps. But instead of following a complete anarchy, these areas actually showed they could remain cohesive on the base of some other powers, because otherwise, it had been those same powers that had brought to the disgregation. It had been the case like that when the Germans had tried to reimpose the monarchy onto Italy. It was the single cities that fought kind of for their own autonomy at that point. But once the Germans went away, they were kind of everyone on his own, one against the other. The same went into Germany the same way. There were certain princes that had actively struggled to get rid of the central monarchy, and they succeeded it. And they succeeded it because they had power that they wanted to structure on their own to seize the monarchy, right? And that's why eventually, in fact, what you have is that there is the rise of such dynasties like the Habsburgs, the Wittelsbachs, the Wettins, or the Hohenzollern, also kind of a bit later, but still emerging as the Luxembourgs, actually, not specifically in Germany, but in Bohemia. And this is something important to realize, because you would expect this systems to have kind of crumbled on their own. Instead, were able to build something over. But interestingly enough, these powers were quite advanced for late medieval standards, but they didn't make it to go beyond and to compete fundamentally with the major feudal monarchies that were being formed elsewhere. Chiefly France, let's be honest about this, and also Spain, naturally. And if you take the Italian wars of the late 15th, beginning of, in the 16th century in general, well, you realize that this system, as advanced as it could be, as modern as it could be, the Italians now set the political theory for the modern state. They were on the lead on diplomacy, on all these administrative fields, but they still weren't able to create something that went beyond, and probably they would have achieved in a certain sense. And what happened in this period, I mean, if they had been left alone, what had happened during this century we're looking at today, is that there had been certain premises, let's say, especially during the 14th century, might have led to a more unitary settlement of the peninsula, let's say, especially central in the north, because when we talk about Italy, that's Italy now. The rest is the Kingdom of Naples, it's the Aragonese, it's not the kingdom. But talking about communal Italy, the seigneuries, etc., that was the thing. And the reason why it didn't happen, we'll see now which one was really. And we really don't know, because things might have gone otherwise, objectively. So, starting from the mid-14th century, there is one general consideration we can make, is that Italy had rocketed into this progressive stratification and centralization of power. Like at the beginning of the 14th century, so like 2 generations before, it was really the situation of all the various city-states scattered. Yeah, there were already some seigneuries. It was something, but the perception was still like, yeah, we are a league, really, not a seigneury of one city over the other, and there is always this kind of contractual interaction for which, yeah, we kind of act together. But quite soon this had evolved through a lot of warfare, actually, into something way more stratified, and something way more centralized as well. And major powers had emerged, and other seigneuries that up to that point might have done something in order to take their place in the scenario, kind of started lagging behind. For instance, there are the Gonzaga in Mantua that are this seigneury that actually had taken the place of the Bonacolsi before. This was a quite powerful seigneury that had extended its power around Mantua, Modena, and all these kind of central pattern cities that at one point was even stronger than other dynasties that eventually had rose to the top, like the Della Scala, for instance, that they were substantially allied with. The same Gonzaga had overthrown the Bonacolsi with the support of the Della Scala, incidentally. And then the Este in Ferrara. Actually, the Este dynasty remained quite a very, non-indifferent power. It's even difficult to frame fundamentally, because they had a lot of land, but they weren't this enormously wealthy or financially developed center. They stretched the domains into kind of agricultural or even sometimes marshy areas, etc. They were quite warlike dynasty. Even the Gonzaga were. Actually, the Gonzaga were highly regarded, especially for their cavalry, etc. Ferrara would become really the most developed artillery maker, especially in the 15th century. So they started, and this seigneuries, even small, they were vital even for the political balance of the peninsula, because they were naturally constantly required to join either one side or the other, and they could really make be the tip of the balance of the whole system. So they even had their fortune because of that, because they maybe two rivals instead then seizing one of these two and risking the whole, maybe entire, decades of warfare for it, etc. Would try, let's just buy them, let's make them side from our side, and let's not attack them. So many of them even survived because of this. The At the same time, however, these were still secondary seigneuries. The major ones had kind of emarginated them, right? And there was naturally a lot of warfare involved. I mean, both of these groups kind of were always kind of scheming one against the other. It was a very complicated situation. And a very important moment in this story had occurred in the 30s of the 14th century, where the Della Scala seigneury had been wiped out. This was the Della Scala lordship actually was had in the 30s of the 14th century the second largest military in Europe after the Kingdom of France. They had an enormous power. They basically were located in the northeast of the peninsula, would be the eastern Po Valley, essentially, or the Trevisan Mark, actually. And they had managed to extend their power much of Lombardy and even on Tuscany by seizing Lucca, etc., and trying to invade, even attack Florence. This was a major power that had created problems both to Milan and eventually to Venice, because the Della Scala basically attacked tried to seize the salt works of Venice, in close to the Adriatic Sea, and this had triggered the alliance of Florence and Venice combined. And that was a very intense war that brought to this enormous Della Scala power to collapse, right? And it was mostly a financial war, if you want. Basically, Florence and Venice were the major financial powers in Italy. Hired lots of mercenaries, that is basically thousands of cavalry at the time and tens of thousands of infantry, just to crush the Scala had actually hired the same. So this was an exhausting process, and that was a very importantly aborted seigneury that might have evolved actually in the future. Many say that it was already undermined from the last moments, because a major problem with the Della Scala was the expansion direction, because from one side they had Venice, from the other side they had Milan, from actually in the northern side they had the Habsburgs. So it was very complicated. They opted for the south, but it went wrong. But even that power went very close actually to seize great part of the Italian peninsula at the time, especially in northern and in central Italy, and they vanished. So in a few years actually. So this even tells you that it wasn't that type of power. It was really very rooted and grounded. These seigneuries were properly seigneuries, that is to say, one city that rules over many others, and doesn't do it really with iron fist, especially at the beginning, because the single city doesn't have the demographic strength or even the economical strength to really occupy literally everything. It would have been they would have bled white at that point, but kind of committing all the other cities into the enterprise, really, becoming always more despotic and tyrannic. Of course, occupying these cities entailed to really having depleted them of any kind of autonomous, not pulsion, because they obviously wanted to, and in many cases they achieved to escape this grip, but especially of the military force. Like most of these cities in the beginning of the 14th century had seen a sharp decline, sharp fall into the military quality of their militias, right? And that's why in Italy this time the mercenary troops rise in importance so much, because it turned out there was plenty of troopers, especially coming even from abroad, that were attracted by the Italian money, and they fought for them as heavy cavalry of professionals, and the popular militias, the infantries, etc., that Italy had been fairly famous for up to that point, couldn't, after a prolonged warfare like the one that had followed in the first 30 years, continuously of the 14th century, had really exhausted them at the point that they didn't want to go to war anymore, right? And so this happened in similar ways also in the rest of Europe, because actually in the rest of Europe, in the beginning of 14th century, you have certain regions that have this kind of tactical progress of infantries especially, but those were, they kind of faded towards the mid 14th century in the same exact way. Probably the Black Death had a very important role into that, because it was really a matter of demographic strength. Cities were heavily hit, but it's probably not just of that. But let's say that there is this ascending phase and then decline of infantries in Europe that basically never reappears at a popular level. I mean, this restarts with the Swiss in the mid-15th century. Were actually a hybrid, because they were kind of popular infantries, but now they were being trained as professionals, and they started becoming professionals increasingly. So that changed the way of warfare. And by the way, the Swiss model was adopted chiefly not by other city-states, but by that didn't have the resources to do what the Swiss were doing, because that was the entire Switzerland committed to that unique effort. But there were princely states. Take the Habsburgs with the Landsknechts. The French even try something similar, but it screws up. The Spanish get it right, actually, and they obtained the best formula at the beginning of the 16th century. But say that's wholly another story, right? And Italy was wealthier than those other European regions. So what happened is that paradoxically the rise of infantries had started earlier back in the day, in the 12th and 13th century, but it ended earlier at the same time. So that's why there is this kind of shift between these areas of Europe. But at the same time, you can't you see that even the condottieri warfare at this point brings to a sort of evolution. It's not really a regression, right? And even this sort of refeudalization of mercenary armies under, let's say, seigneurial dynasties, it entails some progress. It's just that this system arrived at the thresholds of the modern age, doesn't have the time or the resources to make the leap forward and to create something more unitary and more cohesive, more monarchical, actually, has, as we know, and that's why the peninsula was wealthier, and even in terms of material power was way more powerful. I mean, just take the fleets of Venice and Genoa combined. If they had stayed united, there was no naval power in Europe that could even set foot into Italy. But they didn't care, because they felt themselves to be kind of individual states. They didn't give a damn about each other. They preferred someone else to come rule around than having the neighbor rising too strong, right? And there weren't objectively the premises up to that point to create something more evolute. And the same goes for Germany, that had the similar story. But at least in Germany, what happened is that although, well, yeah, of course, there is the 30 Years' War, many also during the 18th century, a lot of wars in there. But at the same time, kind of the Germans remain in charge of the situation. They're kind of poor, fragmented, and all these problems. But at least they are Germany's such a mess. There are literally 1,000 states there, so nobody wants to get in there for long, right? So it's way more complicated. Italy has a wholly different story. But this is not today's topic. But the important is that everything starts from here, from this century that we're discussing right now. So there is after the first 30 years of continuous warfare in Italy, there is a moment of a relative of exhaustion, right? Because these systems couldn't take it anymore, and that's part of the reason why the same lordship takes over, because people say, okay, we don't want to fight anymore, let's just rule us as long as we are in peace. We don't care if the commune is over. I mean, the communes are never over actually, but now they're ruled by someone else immediately. So say I give you I accept you to rule me as a kind of a foreign element of another city, but as long as you let me out of that. In fact, the affirmation of the seigneuries is largely even consensual, but this is often overlooked. I mean, it passed through the consumptions of the local resources, but at one point there was even an active seeking of the same seigneurial regime. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Chiefly for the sake of peace, right? We want to be pacified. We don't want war anymore. Unfortunately, however, things evolve in a different fashion, because towards the mid-14th century, there is a new way of warfare that basically will not stop until the first half of the following century. And there is this series of wars broke out as a form of struggle between the most powerful entity, that was the Milanese one. Milan was ruled by the Visconti seigneury, famously enough, and the other cities of Italy that at that point realized that the Visconti were too strong, and they create this anti-Visconti leagues, basically. They were periodically renewed because the Milanese power now was expanding. I told to you about the Della Scala exactly because of this reason, because the Della Scala had been, up to that point, sound major opponents of the Milanese in the Po Valley. They were very suspicious one of the other, and they never quite fought each other. Actually, they were allies because they were both Ghibellines, but they always looked upon each other with great suspicion, and the whole thing was incredibly complicated by the balance, maintaining the balance. So even alliances were sometimes a matter of necessity rather than actual political sympathy, as you can imagine. So when the Della Scala get wiped out, there is really no one filling that gap over there. So what the Milanese think is that, now we're the major power in Lombardy, in the Po Valley, to say, so let's expand far and wide, because, by the way, Lombardy is very wealthy, it's very rich, it's full of cities, there are some of the major intercontinental traffics passing from there. Controlling it was really and it's a kind of a logical regional boundary in itself. It's closed by the Apennines, by the Alps, so by the sea, so it's kind of compact. It had been the same base of the Longobards kingdom, just for saying, there are certain things that are repeated historically, even on these geographical bases. Naturally, this is something very different. It's not properly a monarchy at all, right? It's really, always remember like that. One mother city, if we can tell, but not even mother, because there is no replication of other cities like it had been Rome in ancient times, like in that. But one leading city and all the others that kind of follow, right? But they are formally submitted. There are, in this case, Visconti vicaries all over the place, and controlling, exacting tolls. And there is the very important Milanese financial wealth of all the bankers of Milan that back the regime. So very far from feeling oppressed by that, there is this bunch of oligarchs essentially that invest in the same wars that the Visconti wage, so that they are able to knock out entire cities and seizing them and to reinvest. So that's also why the Milanese had the largest army at this point, where they were so powerful, because they had a lot of money, right? And they had even some of the Visconti leadership was very warlike, especially it had in its origin. Lombardy had, differently from Tuscany, a much greater nobiliar mindset, right? The great lords of Lombardy, they were famous. There were all these dynasties of ancient prestige that maybe, even if they weren't actually stemming from feudal dynasties, but were very powerful and very seigneurial in nature, right? In Tuscany, there was all another mindset. It was mostly about republican regimes, right? More or less masked as democracies, in fact, but they were fundamentally, they were lordships as well, but they had a wholly different political culture. So, naturally, we will have to deal with all of this stuff in detail one day, but to make long story short, the Milanese expand a lot, a freaking lot. The apex of Milanese expansion happens under the seigneury of Gian Galeazzo Visconti, who ruled between 1385 and 1402, who managed to conquer Verona. That's very important because that had been the base of the Della Scala dynasty, right? So that was the core of the ancient dynasty and of the Trevisan mark at that point. Padua, that had also been a very important center back in the day. Now it was a very large city, very affluent city, by the way. Now it was ruled by the Carrarese dynasty, but they were a minor, like a C series or B series, let's say, maybe in between seigneury. And they seized this. This is basically all northwestern Italy, right? Or almost all of it. However, some of the most productive areas. Because if you go further east, it's much more feudal in character, very much more similar to Germany than. And even the Trevisan mark actually was very feudal in nature. There were these cities, but they didn't have a huge influence on the countryside historically. And so on, and the Visconti actually stopped formally the same Della Scala dynasty, because the Della Scala dynasty had lived on actually in these cities, even though it had been devoided or deprived of all its major power since now quite about couple of generations now, and the Milanese at this point take a further leap forward, and they invade, just like the La Scala had done, and also the same Milanese at one point, central Italy. And they go as far, telling the truth, they even occupy, they extend their seigneury even in the Ligurian region, on Genoa, this other major financial center of Europe. They're able to seize this because, by the way, they're also very close geographically, and they enter into central Italy, and they do something very dangerous, especially for Florence, but also actually for everyone, but also for the papacy, for Venice, because what happens is that they seize Pisa, Siena, Perugia, Spoleto, and Bologna. So these are cities that were very powerful. Like Pisa had been one of the major maritime republics, renowningly. It had been one of also a very solid financial center, trade center mostly, but it was a florid community, etc. They could control the access. That was a great trouble for Florence, because Florence always had this problem of getting access to the sea directly. I mean, they were well connected historically to the Angevin kingdom in the south, via land actually, but the Visconti now sees formally for some time the seigneury both of Pisa and of Siena. Siena is in the south of Florence, and that controls the major ways go for the south. So basically Florence is choked and freaks out, right? And the Visconti even expand into Umbria, so in Perugia, as we said, in Spoleto, and also sees this happened all temporarily, right? But it was enough to really drive everyone mad, even Bologna. It was one of the major cities around, and it was actually a papal possession, at least by name. The popes never quite reached that place. They had some legates were ruling on there, but they now the papal states, by the way, is just come back from Avignon, so it's a great problem to come to reconquer much, even what they had close to Rome, right, before they could get up there. That would happen much later in time. Bologna will make one day part of the Papal States, right? So what is we can't be stressed enough in here is that this extension, this domination was fluctuating. The question is, how could the Milanese really expand so fast and so wide? Well, we've explained naturally what their power was about, but there is another character that we have kind of hinted at before, that is the nature of the lordship in itself. I mean, in Lombardy, around Milan, the Visconti could effectively control many cities, and they did actually a very good job at that, because, by the way, the Milanese formed what was more resemblant to a modern state than all the rest of the peninsula. They tried to uniform all the administrations, to control all these satellite cities of in Lombardy, etc., and to make something working even well in terms of military administration and finances. It was very orderly, right? The other seigneuries were like more based on particularisms, like, okay, we have with every single city a relation of alliance, but there's no uniformity. Well, when the Milanese get out of Lombardy, they achieve the lordship, let's say, both with arms, because objectively they came there with pretty imposing armies to reclaim it, but at the same time they got so easily that lordship by name, which was what was literally the local government, the local city council giving them, okay, recognizing them formally as their own lords, and maybe sharing the control of the city in some ways, etc. But it was pretty much it. And the reason why these cities did it is that naturally they preferred, to be part of, to be under the domination of a guy who lived hundreds of kilometers away, than a pretty hungry and aggressive and bully-like commune that was just like a few tens kilometers away. So in other words, they wanted to enjoy a decentralized government, and that why was the Milanese model was so seductive, because everybody knew at that time that the Milanese power could crumble from a moment to another because of, as we will see now, even what will happen, dynastic problems actually, and therefore they preferred that to the stricter government of a local lord, right, that came from a neighboring city. So that's why nominally the Milanese come to encompass at one point almost all of northern and central Italy at this time, but just on paper, at least can't say by large, but let's say in substantial part. The Pope also was naturally freaking out because the Milanese were traditionally Ghibelline, as we've said, and they were therefore against the papacy, or at least they were working for the empire theoretically. Now, if the empire at this point even tries at one point with Charles IV to invade, Lombardy is crushed, etc., by the Visconti. So at one point the Visconti even buy the ducal title from the emperor. So they try to maintain up this fiction of the empire that wasn't even fiction, because effectively that's how the whole thing worked, like theoretically the empire was still standing. So what that was very important, especially for this non-feudal born seigneuries into Italy, to get a formal recognition of feudal authority by the emperor, who was the supreme authority in the feudal hierarchy. So this happens too, and the popes naturally look at this with horror, because they realize that their own domains, that they were extremely jealous and protective and defensive of they are being seized by someone else. Venice freaks out too, because Venice was actually impregnable from land, as we know. At this time, actually, Venice has troubles as usual with Genoa. At a certain point, the Genoese even managed to knock out Venice with the War of Chioggia, and the Venetians managed to counter strike, and they're safe. But it was possible through a ship to a fleet that to defeat Venice at that point. From land, there were not many ways you could do it, at least from a military point of view. No army at the time had the logistical capability of besieging Venice, but Venice was based on trade, and if you surrounded Venice and you choked it and you absorbed all of its trade, you could effectively do a very big damage and to send the Venetian Republic bankrupt. So the Venetians were not interested in terrestrial domination at all, but they just wanted to be sure that around Venice there was no major competitor, that things could work without many problems. And the terrestrial interventions of Venice are very rare. So from now, as we will see, things will take a very different turn into Venetian, politics and strategy. That was designed exactly to counter Milan and its the Visconti expansionism, and that's why all these powers made league against the Milanese. So the Milanese had immediately troubles after it had seized all these cities to manage the local autonomies, because these cities had given their lordship to Milan, but they didn't to the Visconti, because this is important to think. When we talk about seigneuries, we're not talking about an actual city government. We're talking about a family that rules over the city and other cities. So that's properly what it is. There is no thing like a city incorporating another city institutionally. There is nothing like that. It's still the lordship that extends on various degrees over several communities. That is what effectively even cities are and communes are. But every commune maintains its own government. There are gradual transformations of titles, of etc. There is obviously a restriction of the base of power, social certification. That is fewer people basically at the top and the others following, but it's still something locally based. It's very autonomous. And a great way to rule these cities was simply require them money and leaving them to do whatever they wanted with their own laws, right? Naturally, the military aspect is important also in here, because of course the city, once it was under someone's seigneury, wasn't really free to do whatever they wanted. For example, in expansionistic terms, I mean, sometimes they could do it, but the seigneury was most of the times equated to even giving military power, that is control of the city in itself, really, and the mobilization of its own resources, etc. That naturally, think about the decentralized governments of the time. If something happens, basically the city remains there, while the lord can be so very far, so you can't retake power without not much of a problem, right? So it really depends even on the deterrence. I mean, as long as there are strong armies around, everybody kind of surrenders, right? If there is no local strength, no local resources to oppose to that, why risking to lose what is left for nothing, essentially. But after some time, if something goes wrong, like a military defeat or dynastic problems, everything can be easily reversed, or fairly easily reversed, especially at this distance that we have observed. So the death of Gian Galeazzo Visconti brings to a successory crisis in Milan. Mm. And therefore there is another phase that sees the expansion of the two major republics that we have seen, Venice and Florence, that started to benefit of this vacuum left by the Visconti into the two areas that had been that we have been conquered at that point. So both in let's say Eastern Lombardy and in Tuscany, respectively. So in something like one generation, 25 years, these two republics came to extend over enormous territories, respectively 30,000 and 12,000 square kilometers, right? So this is an enormous gain in territory. It's like half of a kingdom, and especially on very wealthy lands, right? So even other larger monarchies out there in Europe were, they didn't have quite the same concentration of wealth that existed into Italy. And if you wonder why the Italians created a renaissance, well, because they had a freaking lot of money. So they had a lot of money to invest also in other activities that weren't just, the bare necessities, and they had this capacity of investing on art, technology, and all that stuff that they became famous for. So Florence, at the same time, there is one thing though to remember, is that this, on average at least, the Italian lordships were something very different from other from other states, let's say. First of all, they weren't monarchies proper. The closest that looked to a monarchy was Milan, indeed. Then, of course, there were other kind of feudal powers, but they were of minor entity. Then there were, on the other extreme, were kind of republican-like regimes, like Florence, for instance, was the flag bearer of republicanism against the Milanese tyranny, that, by the way, was meant even by the same Milanese in a positive fashion. Like the Milanese, who naturally sided with the regime, were proud of the tyranny, because the term tyranny was used in the actual etymological sense of the word, was meant as a form of government with kind of a monarchical direction. But all of them were, on average, kind of mercantile republics, to tell it all. I mean, at least for European standards. Like, while you had the Kingdom of France, the Kingdom of England, Kingdom of Castile, all this stuff, you have a solid feudal system that is really a giant, right? The Italians don't have anything of this. They have the Kingdom of Naples, that, as we've seen, it's not really what we're talking about. This is a feudal monarchy, but even in there, we will see it now later. It was a freaking mess. And in full decline at this point. But they were extremely tight-fisted. I mean, I know it sounds bad, but they didn't want to spend much. I mean, especially feudal entities, really invested almost everything into war. The Italian republics, all they wanted to do wanted to be left alone. I mean, that's really how it had been, even with the struggle for against the Orange stuff. And it's not that the Italians wanted to, to be subversive, or to, not to have an emperor. They just wanted to be left alone, to make their own money, to grow, become richer, to treasure, and it is brilliantly exemplified, especially by the maritime republics. If you take Venice, especially, was much into this. Milan, I told you before, it was something, was what was closer to a modern state in many ways, because it had this more balanced and actually more markedly military mindset, right, together with the monarchical form. A republic like Florence, for instance, was completely different. Everybody, there was basically this oligarchy of merchants, of great merchants, that had an enormous amount of money, and all they wanted to do was to remain just like that. not to spend too much. Florence had an enormous amount of money, but it never invested much of it into the military, right? A kingdom like, I don't know, France would invest basically everything into the military, right? So there are these great differences that are naturally that are important to understand, because for instance, the Florentines were extremely distrustful of mercenaries. Yet they were obliged to use them at one point, because that was the only way they could have an army at that point. Also because, as we have seen, the city militias had declined in quality. Nobody really wanted to go out there to fight, die. They were too wealthy to do that. They had too much to lose. So what was bad? You hire professionals of war. You send them to die for you. But they were extremely suspicious, and even rearming the citizenry was something very risky for the oligarchy, for the government, because basically they would risk to create now a new class, middle class, that would be way more democratic than the actual republican government was. And that would create problems in the city. But there had been problems in here towards the 70s, especially the 14th century. There had been these major waves of revolts of the salaried workers in the city states all over Italy, actually, and they're all repressed. And that tells you, by the way, how the society was balanced in the sense that the governments had managed to keep things down. It was actually useful for pacification, because there weren't major upheavals. The cities now were relatively orderly, right? But for this reason, they didn't invest into creating a more solid form of government that could be more, more aggressive, more strategically minded. Especially I must say, the northern seigneuries were much more military in nature, and for various reasons, actually, and some of them are different. The Milanese, for the reasons we have explained, but also for ancient traditions. Venice, because Venice never quite had to use land armies, but they had regular fleets fighting out there, so they knew what the cost of war was and how profitable it could be. But especially in Tuscany, and Florence was really the peak of this. Florence was kind of the guy who didn't want to spend anything for war if it was possible, and this actually slowed down incredibly his own expansion into Tuscany itself. Because if the Florentines had spent what the Della Scala or the Visconti had spent for war, they would have reached an enormous power very quickly. I mean, even the Papal States were more powerful than Florence. Actually, the Papal States, this is very overlooked, the Papal States had an enormous pool of military men, of condottieri, were extremely effective. Lots of condottieri from this time came from the Papal States, from the area of Rome, or think about the Montefeltro from Urbino. The Papal State, however, was very disordered, and if it had been more compact, even in that case, but that was a problem of ancient origin, let's say, the Papal States had an immense military. They had immense manpower and quite warlike very effective commanders, and this is particularly interesting as a perspective. And those guys had instead a completely feudal mindset, right? It's like when Lorenzo de' Medici marries Clarice Orsini, or the Orsini were a Roman family that were feudal-like, and when they married, there was this struggle in Florence, naturally, when Clarice had been brought, because the Medici wanted to teach, to educate the children of the couple, like in the Republican fashion, the Neoplatonic ideals, this kind of bourgeois mindset that was typical of the Florentines. The Orsini were all about war. They were a knightly class. They were military men. They had a completely different, and this is important. It is true, kind of a blending, two aspects. Like it's true that the more the let's say the popular regimes become powerful, and the more they resemble the military, the seigneurial class, and also the even the Milanese seigneuries start to get kind of more refined. The richer they were, maybe imitating most of this refined environments of other, let's say, less less Spartan um, republics, but it was still this difference are still weighed in the eventual political the direction that these powers also took, right? And in the case of Florence, this power, Florence had emerged as a power of some notice actually only from the mid-13th century. I mean, Florence is a very old city. It had also this very precocious orientation towards, the arts even. No, it's not so marked at this time, but we know that even in the 11th century was someone deputed into the commune for this artistical affairs and all this stuff. But they emerge as a power to be reckoned with, especially financially speaking, from the mid 13th century, when they make an enormous amount of money by subcontracting the supplies for the Papal Angevin crusade against the kingdom of Sicily, of Manfred of Swabia, and basically they monopolize all the Sicilian grain exports towards the north, and they make an enormous amount of money. And they're particularly tied, in fact, to the Angevin dynasty that paid this Tuscan merchants with let's say by making them administering the many resources of the Neapolitan kingdom. And they, in fact, at one point it's the acciaiuoli, some Tuscan merchants and bankers that rule effectively even the Angevin administration in southern Italy. But Florence becomes the richest city in the entire globe. At this point, it has a higher income of the whole kingdom, a higher income than the one of the whole kingdom of England, but it never quite reaches even a provincial scale of power, right? Tuscany is full of other cities, and Florence has more than a military expansion capability, a great financial expansion capability. That is, is able to tie all these cities to her just by overwhelming them financially. In 1289, the Florentines win this major battle of Campaldino against Arezzo. That was the dreaded neighbor. Was firstly Ghibelline. Obviously, Florence is, by being allied of the Angevins, is wealth is quite. There is a moment, it even kind of sides temporarily, very briefly at the beginning of the 14th century, not really with the empire, but there is the white regime that was kind of very very sympathetic even for the Ghibellines. But at this point it expands extremely slowly. The Florentines have even Florence is is a very strong city as a system, right? It's even able to divert the imperial siege of Henry III to the city. It has this great material resilience, right? It has a lot of supplies of power, demographic strength, but it doesn't invest into the military enough, or at least when she does it, her military forces are not particularly committed. It's not that probably had good army, even maybe good soldiers, but the real problem was the cohesion of the unity of command. Really, it was often split between all the various factions that ruled the city, because, by the way, war at this point was waged even when a condottiere was hired and entrusted the command of the army. Was still all dictated by the city council. So, and some major disasters would entail. Actually, Florence throughout all this time has an astonishing collection of defeats, of military disasters, sometimes at the hands, much smaller powers, like this, especially in the first half of the 14th century, and therefore it has an extremely slow expansion, in spite of the enormous wealth that no other power in the world basically had at this point, at least so readily available in terms of of money, of stuff you could cash immediately from the market. There are naturally many other things one could say. That generally bank crisis that starts happening at one point towards the mid 15th century, actually at the beginning, the first half of the 14th century. In fact, Florence will never be as rich in proportion historically as in later times than it had been in the first half of the 14th century. I mean, even the Medici lordship in the 15th century is very wealthy. It's actually the wealthiest family Florence has ever seen, but altogether it's never as financially, in absolute terms, financially powerful had it had been back in the day. So, however, it expands, right? As we have seen now, with especially exploiting the vacuum left by the Visconti, and is able to seize formally Arezzo. Arezzo was already absorbed in a way or another towards the 30s, the 40s of the 14th century, but then is seized completely. Then they're able to take Pisa in 406, right? We've seen the Milanese had seized that now it's lost and the Florentines take it. This was a very symbolical event, very significant event, let's say, because Pisa had been kind of the historical rival of Florence on a longer range in Tuscany, because Pisa was a maritime republic, so it had a completely different mindset from the other Tuscan cities. It was fiercely Ghibelline, at least traditionally. It was, however, one of the few maritime republics that had even, some terra firma possession into the Tuscan mainland. So it had been this kind of anomaly that, especially the Guelphs, had always looked upon, like, the devil in person, something like that. And so what happens is that they managed to seize this city that had represented historically the only city capable of competing for wealth and prestige to Florence in Tuscany. Looking northeast instead, taking Venice into consideration, definitely Venice decides at a certain point to expand into the mainland. In past videos, I have naturally highlighted what is obvious, that Venice expanded now into the mainland for the first time, into the as a response against the Milanese threat, essentially. But there were also other reasons. That Venice, when the Fourth Crusade in 1204 had come to an end with the sack of Constantinople, the Venetians had, by right, to dispose of, I don't remember what, if 1/3 or 1/4 of the whole territories of the Byzantine Empire. The rest was split among the French. But the Venetians were extremely clever. They didn't know what to do with that land, which was a completely different culture, different confession. All they wanted was to control the ports, right? Because that's how you really make money. Very heavily fortified ports that nobody has the logistical capabilities, and especially a navy like the Venetian one, to siege to besiege, and therefore to keep making money. Just like that. It's a very closed world. I mean, the Venetians definitely travel far and wide, but all they hear is about Venice. There is nothing else out there. It's their own universe. It's their own life. In the Italian mainland, it was a bit like that as well, but definitely was a broader understanding of and a broader interest for what was happening among all the various powers. Venice was working just by itself. Now, Venice was threatened, as we've seen, by Genoa, and actually Venice was much more powerful and resilient, especially than Genoa. Had a much better structured government and political solidity. The Genoese were still a bunch of clans, basically, that controlled several parts of the city and ruled everything privately on the base of their adjustments. Venice had a pretty solid from the end of the 13th century, pretty solid government with very specific functioning and dynamics that they controlled very strictly, and was able to recover even from these massive blows of the war against the Genoese in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Greece, etc. And in fact, they're able even to knock out the Genoese as the major competitors into the Eastern Mediterranean. They achieve it even allying themselves with the Aragonese. So it's a very complicated story, as you understand. So what they say is that, okay, let's do something like let's add to our power something that goes aside, goes beyond, let's say, naval power, right? Because the Milanese pressure us, and we need a kind of a buffer state or some kind of shield to contain the Milanese power. And secondly, we can't seize all this stuff that it's here in just next door into mainland Italy to reinforce our trade profits by seizing all the local resources. So the Venetians at this point do something that is truly exceptional and very finely carried out. That is, they are able in a very few years, in an extremely different way from what the bradypic rhythms of Florence, to seize abruptly and very fast an enormous amount of cities into Lombardy. Basically, they arrive like a few tens kilometers from Milan. They take, they arrive up to Brescia and Bergamo in Lombardy. So the Visconti basically found themselves with the Venetians just a few kilometers away from Milan. All this area of northeastern and central Lombardy, from on the left bank of the Po Valley, is seized by Venice. It's a very big area. By the way, encompasses lots of trade routes, especially the Adige Valley that connects Germany and Italy. Is one of the major highways of Europe at that time. By the way, Bavaria and Venice commerce very intensely at this point. They share a lot of know-how, technological advancements, and so on. And they occupy all of these cities and countrysides that had been at that point subjugated, first by the Della Scala originally, and then by the Milanese lords. There is no comparison with Florence. Florence had extended his power very slowly, and basically just asking every city, okay, to have this formal recognition of the Florentine friendship. There were a bunch of functionaries sent there by Florence, checking what the city was doing, and nothing else, basically, just letting them work on their own, because Florence was too rich. So even going against it meant to even lose a lot of money. There was not even a need to send armies against these cities. You could simply starve them very quickly by of course there were military operations led, but at the same time was this imposant Florentine financial power that was inescapable in Tuscany. So in fact, Tuscany, even in the 16th century, when the Grand Duchy is created, so Tuscany is framed into this broader, bit like Milan, in this broader Holy Roman Imperial feudal hierarchy, etc., with a better defined institutional profile, is much more seigneurial and dynastic in nature. Still, Florence Tuscany and the Florentine rule is characterized by this very decentralized government, lots of autonomies, and this will even set a trend that will a political orientation during the Enlightenment will make these areas the ones to abandon, for instance, death penalty for the first time in the West, and having very advanced, generally speaking. The Florentines were chiefly thinkers, philosophers, great scholars, humanists, so they had this broader capability of theoretical development. Think about the great great thinkers. Think about Machiavelli. Think about this was they were fundamentally about. But still, their government was relatively mild, relatively autonomous, and based on this financial fluidifier, let's say that Florence could afford. The Venetians do something completely different. They do actually, they maintain the local autonomies as well, but they frame all this in a very homogeneous control over these cities. They control it from a military point of view. They build fortifications. They even thief and settle their own condottieri and their troops in all the various on these various centers. So they create a regional state that is pretty big, actually, extensionally speaking. It stretches from especially the 20s of the 15th century, from Brescia to the east of Venice, in at the borders of the Aquileian, actually beyond, even in Friuli, and from the Alps to the Po River. So it's a very big power that has to be summed with all the Venetian colonies abroad, with Crete, with the Peloponnese, etc. Of all the let's say the maritime empire that Venice had managed to create. So it was at one point, especially after the Milanese were knocked out after the wars of Italy, Venice was the largest power in Italy. Exception made actually for the Southern Kingdom, but the Southern Kingdom was at that point kind of a vice kingdom of Spain, so it was something, say, different and not so. It was kind of autonomous, but still was not really free of doing what it was. Still declined to the needs. Was still oriented towards the needs of Spain, broadly speaking. So at the end of the 14th century, there had been successory crises also elsewhere. Their solution committed the territorial states up to the first decades of the 15th century, when for the first time were created the conditions to maintain, at least to search for, a more stable balance, right? So in the Kingdom of Naples, the crisis was opened at the end of the regency of the Queen Joanna I in 1381, and so this struggle between Charles of the Iraqian, that was backed by the papacy, and Louis of Anjou, that was supported by the same Joanna. And this struggle was the catalyst element of the new division between the Iraqian branch and the Angevins, that, after having lasted for very long, opened to the conquest of the Neapolitan kingdom from the side of Aragon in 1442. That basically brought to what had been split with the Sicilian, had been started with the Sicilian Vespers. It was the division of the two southern kingdoms, or better, of the Kingdom of Sicily had been at the beginning. The Kingdom of Sicily, it was not just Sicily, it was like this big chunk of peninsular southern and even partly of central Italy. So the Aragonese had Sicily up to this point, after the Vespers and the Aragonese invasion, that they had taken away from the Angevins, and in 1442 they invade the Neapolitan kingdom proper, so that they reunify. And basically, the Angevin branch is now extinguished in the rule of Naples. So that will also entail the all the French aims on the Kingdom of Naples, that will be even at the base, naturally, of the wars of Italy, So this was a kind of a very complicated affair as well. We will see more clearly on another occasion. But this thing, I'm making it extremely simple, but it's extremely complicated. Extremely complicated, especially from a dynastic point of view, but all what this entailed in terms of international relations. Like, around this Italian system was revolving the entire European policy. Every power was now worried that the balance of that lordship would cause the strengthening either of France or Spain or the Habsburgs, and everybody was completely this had overwhelming effects on powers like Burgundy, England. It was a real mess, right? And it was evident that the problem with the Italian system was pretty unstable. By the way, it's kind of interesting that at this point the rest of the European powers was engulfed into something else. Like France, that had this major aims towards the Italian peninsula, at this point was engulfed in the 100 Years' War. Germany was now fragmented. The Spanish kingdoms were still not united. So everything, actually in all the rest of Europe, was pretty fluid and yet to be decided up to this point. So there was also a similar successory crisis into the Papal States, if we can say like that. No, it's not because of nepotism, not only. That definitely had been started with the transfer of the papal curia to Avignon, and then now was brought back to Rome once again. We have been talking a few days ago about the Papal States during the 14th century. So now, starting essentially from that the point we had left, what you see is that the papal curia went back to Rome in 1377 by decree of Gregory XI, and in 1378 there was this major division of the College of French cardinals that intended to bring back the papacy to Avignon, right? And others that, instead, by electing Urban VI, opted for the Roman seat. So this brought to the major event known as Schism of the West, that brought that was triggered by the election of the let's say Philo-French Pope Clement the VII. And for more than 30 years, basically the whole Europe would side either with one pope or the other, and this produced also, it's extremely complicated now, we don't have the time to tell the story, but to make the long story short, in 1409 the Council of Pisa, convoked to heal this fracture, had even the paradoxical effect to bring to the election of a third pope. So there were three popes at one time, and only in 1417 finally the Council of Constance managed to impose Martin V as sole pope. Martin V was a very important figure. He gave a lot of new prestige to Rome, where effectively the papacy was to remain, the papal curia was to remain. Avignon actually was maintained into the papal domains, but now the papacy had come back to Rome, and so once healed the schism, and definitely re-established themselves into Italy, the popes kept to work on that recomposition of their territorial power into central Italy, and specifically that had started into the 14th century. In the other video we were talking about Aegidius of Albornoz that had kind of prepared the path for this further strengthening of papal domination in central Italy. So the papacy this time worked a lot, especially with the greater cities of this area of the papal states, over which up to this point the papacy had just a barely factual power. It was very formal most of the times actually. We're talking about these major cities are the ones of Bologna, Perugia, Ancona and Macerata. If you see, the first two were the ones that had been occupied. They were actually the most important ones, and they had been temporarily fallen into the seigneury of the Visconti. So that's why the papacy was freaking out, because those were the most important cities of its own domains after Rome. So these cities had each their own histories. Bologna was this major agricultural center. It was one of the largest cities in Italy and had its own times. Now it has a kind of a lordships on its own. Perugia was also kind of similar. It was in the heart of the Apennine. It had been very important for papal domination because it had been led expanding by the papacy very aggressively on its neighbors, as long as it was a very faithfully pro-papal city, at least by name. Ancona was a maritime republic in the Marches, and Macerata too was a major, paper mill production center, but it's these were mostly economical centers, as you understand, and all of these cities lived a kind of their own communal autonomy from up to that point, and they had their own seigneuries, as we have seen every once in a while, but they got this chance of the renewed papal strength to re-establish certain convenient relations with the popes, maintaining at least a part of their ancient rights, their ancient prerogatives. So everything was bargained here. Everything was negotiated. It was never a radical elimination of the local autonomies. There is nothing like that. That's something that Europe will have to see in many years. But what we observe is a degree of homogenization that is brought into the local administration, with certain vicarial figures that are sent there to control, to collect taxes, to try to make something that works. Even for effective administration, there was the need to pacify these areas, to rebuild infrastructures, to make trade safe. And actually, it was very difficult, and very progressive as a whole. The popes took a lot of time, right, to achieve this. And the Milanese in this moment are able to raise up once again with Filippo Maria Visconti in who ruled from between 1412 and 1447. This was a very important phase into Milanese history because it restarted a policy of expansion aimed at regaining power over the lost territories. All right, and then there is also in here a successory crisis once again, because that sees let's say relative successory crisis, but the Visconti die out and the Sforza come to power with Francesco Sforza. Was a soldier of fortune, if we can't call it like that. Condottiere was at the head of professional troops that was acclaimed as Duke in 1450 in Milan. He he was the son-in-law of Filippo Maria Visconti, so that's what that's what the Visconti legacy lived on, like with his force as well, through the descendancy of the daughter, Filippo's daughter, with and Francesco Sforza, and the Sforza found themselves to rule now on a territory that was, albeit stretching from Switzerland to the Ligurian Sea, was very far to reach the dimensions it had into the 14th century, right? So the process of internal reorganization and the complexive redimensioning of the expansive force of some regional states brought to the push, let's say, of researching a compromise that could grant the maintenance of the reached balance, right? So basically, at this point, Italy is emerging from a other, like, 70 years, if not more, of 80 years of continuous warfare. It was very costly, and this balance was sought for the most evident realization that after all this period of prolonged warfare, there was no way the states could find a more stable balance, right? So there were also external threats to Italy that brought to the whole system to look at itself and say, okay, maybe it's better if we become a bit more cautious, start to invest into something that can preserve us from foreign threats rather than fighting against each other. This was very hypocrite because, as we will see now, even the balance, a firm, complete balance was never reached. But at the same time, there was the Italian League created in 1444, the so-called Peace of Lodi, that had this kind of peaceful intention of not fighting anymore among these powers. The reasons that brought to this had been, well, in 1453, the Ottomans had conquered Constantinople. Now, that had been pretty bad news because the Italians realized that at least in Mediterranean they were next in terms of Ottoman expansionism. You know that in the 80s of the 15th century, the Ottomans even landed into mainland Italy at one point. They even invaded it from the northeast, launching raiding parties, etc. And this was a major threat. 1453 is also the date of the end of the 100 Years' War. Naturally, France had still to recover from the major thing, but it was obvious that now a consolidated French kingdom that had effectively expelled the English presence from France, aside from Calais, but that's virtually insignificant, had now somewhere to expand, and naturally the French expanded mostly towards the northeast, initially towards the Tois and other places like that, towards Burgundy, but also this balance now was pretty risky. Spain would have been unified in a couple of decades, and so the Italians realized, okay, we have to stay sharp now because lots of things can happen and it's not going to be cool, right? But now, especially the Ottomans in the Mediterranean were a big threat, especially for Venice, right? One of the reasons why Venice was also so eager to consolidate its power on the Italian mainland was this increased risk that was being observed into the east. They wanted to have more solid assets aside from just the maritime ones. And so in the Peace of Lodi, the Italian states decided to split the peninsula into certain areas of influence. I made a video about the Peace of Lodi and this kind of equilibrium, as it was called, that ensued. You can check that out. If you go into Medieval Italy playlist, you should find it pretty quickly, but otherwise just go, search Schwerpunkt Peace of Lodi or Italy 1454 or something like that. and sphere of influences is fine, because theoretically, the agreements were much stricter. They were quite picky formally, like that even the smallest castle couldn't be seized. Nobody had to try anything sneaky, right? Everything had to remain crystallized, frozen, in terms of borders, boundaries among these powers. Now, things were very different. It had also been very difficult to achieve this peace. Actually, there was a lot of diplomatic effort to achieve this. There were lots of compromises. Lorenzo de' Medici is credited with this agreement, for the success of this agreement, and so quite simply, there were so in the north there was fundamentally Milan and Venice, right? So this was it. Then there were other minor states always in the north, that like the Duchy of Savoy. There was this Alpine power, was kind of more French than Italian, but now from some centuries had been solidly expanding into the Italian, into the Po Valley actually. So now the strategical location of Savoy into the French Alps was very vital, but at the same time the most valuable assets were into the Po Valley on the Italian side. Then there were the marquisates of Saluzzo and Montferrat that had been they were in the northwest. They were ancient feudal entities that had kind of survived because they weren't extremely sound powers. They were kind of rural, etc., but they had their own importance. They were used as buffer states, etc. Then there was naturally the Republic of Genoa that stayed on the Ligurian Sea from its side, between mountains and sea, and the lordships of Mantua and Ferrara that we have seen before, that were very interesting, balancing elements of the Lombard scenario especially. And then in the center there was Florence, the smaller Siena, that the Florentines were not able to absorb still from some time, and the Papal States, right? So it was kind of more homogeneous. There were actually other smaller entities, telling the truth. There was the Plombinese lordship. There were others, but now they were almost irrelevant, basically. And then in the south there was now the reunified, let's say, Aragonese kingdom, right? Which, telling the truth, administratively speaking, it was still two different vice kingdoms, because the unity of the Kingdom of Sicily was not it was, politically it was such, because now it was ruled by technically the same Aragonese leadership, but it still were two separate entities, and the asset of this kingdom was a bit problematic, because internally, it was a very powerful kingdom in terms of resources, but it was not so expansive, and especially in vice kingdom rule, it was very passive in some ways. It was very important, definitely, for the struggles, eventually, especially of the Spanish, into during the Italian wars, but it still there was a compromised situation internally with the local nobility. The barons were quite autonomous at this point. After all, the decay started in the previous centuries, especially during the late Angevin times, with all these successory crises and so on. So this balance, you can listen to it more in the video that I made on the Peace of Lodi, and that was a system that effectively held in a way or another until the Wars of Italy, until 1494. Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492. So it in many ways the Florentines had had played for this, because they realized also they weren't quite of a very powerful lordship, so at least from a military point of view, so they cared very much about this balance to remain intact, but evidently also the others had something to gain from it. But it was still hypocrite in some way. It was a political crisis overall that would be dramatically manifest at the time of the outbreak of of this peace. That would bring the peninsula to be ravaged by foreign powers that eventually seized large chunks of it, and there was no farsightedness in some ways into the system, but probably no premise that could work really for making something more unitary functioning. And it's really it's really fascinating to wonder what would have happened if Italy had been unified at this point, because basically no other region in Europe had the same amount of resources. They would have become probably an hegemonic system, at least into instead they were split, and they didn't accomplish anything under this point of view. And albeit very rich, very influential, very powerful throughout all, for other 2 centuries, they progressively declined and lost their autonomy, and by the 18th century they lacked now what it was needed to modernize autonomously. Even the Napoleonic Wars were quite dramatic, but in general it was this inability to come to create, let's say, something more organized, more I don't know, where all the states could have a role into a greater goal, a vision. It didn't happen, right? In Germany, with all the problems that existed, this kind of still remained. I mean, the empire still existed. There was still a king, a sole ruler. That didn't work at all, but at least everybody was, looking upon for, kind of at least having a confirmation of their own prerogatives, all this stuff. In Italy, there was nothing like this. Italy had been born as a fiercely autonomous thing that didn't want anything more, imposant, more centralized, and they paid that, because at that point they lacked an effective centralized direction, and they couldn't direct the enormous amount of wealth they had towards something more more lasting, right? And this brings, we'll have to talk a lot about this chapter of European history, because aside from being insultingly overlooked, it's also very important from a military point of view, because it's often misunderstood. I mean, how the modernity passed through even this system, albeit its ultimate failure and crisis, let's say, but we will talk that on another occasion. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.